Hello, and welcome back to our enlightening podcast series on the ever evolving world of artificial intelligence, the AI driven enterprise. I'm your host, Max, and today we dive into part two of our captivating conversation with the esteemed Andrew Pery, a luminary in the field of AI ethics and legislation. If you joined us for part one, you already know we're in for a treat. We uncovered some fascinating insights about AI's impact on our world, and today we're delving even deeper. In this episode, we're focusing on a critical aspect that's shaping the future of AI, legislation and ethics. We're discussing the intricacies of high-risk AI systems, navigating through the EU's pioneering stance on AI regulation, and exploring the intriguing world of generative AI applications. Andrew will shed some light on the vital role of auditing and traceability in AI systems, ensuring compliance and ethical use in this rapidly advancing technology sphere. So whether you're a tech enthusiast, a business leader, or just curious about how AI is reshaping our society and the laws that govern it, this episode is tailor-made for you. Let's dive in and unravel the complexities of AI ethics and legislation with Andrew Pery. Buckle up, it's going to be an interesting journey. Awesome. So, Andrew, we've been hearing a lot about legislation. I think we mentioned it in the introduction as well. There's definitely some risk involved, and legislature is actually categorizing all of these AI systems into different categories. So just to educate our viewers and listeners just a little bit on that particular topic, could you tell us a bit more about what exactly are high-risk AI systems and which categories do we also have?
Yeah, so I think in order to address that question, I think it's important to really kind of distinguish between two classes of AI systems. The first category of which is what's defined as narrow AI applications. And so, these applications are typically purpose-built for specific functions. And they typically use supervised machine learning based on a sample training data set to teach the AI for specific outputs. For example, intelligent document processing or robotic process automation are examples of narrow AI applications. And they do things extremely well, very efficiently, high degree of recognition and accuracy, in fact, better than humans can. So typically, these applications are not necessarily considered to be high-risk AI systems. Right? So things like document capture, invoice processing, those kinds of applications, they typically don't have a dimension of high risk associated with them. But there are certain types of narrow AI applications that could be considered to be high risk. So for example, resume tracking applications, resume HR applications, credit decisioning system, loan application processing, insurance applications where AI technology is used, but potentially could produce adverse outcomes. So in this context, then it's important to make sure that the AI systems produce accurate results, fair outcomes. So that's certainly one aspect of what might be classified as high-risk AI systems. But then there's another category of AI systems which are defined as general AI applications. And this is where we've seen significant momentum over the last little while with the emergence and proliferation of ChatGPT and other sort of conversational generative AI applications that they use much more advanced AI technology, neural networks. They work against very large content repositories. They use natural language processing to generate the outputs. Now, for example, ChatGPT is predominantly using information from the internet, but the knowledge base only dates back to 2021. So, while these general AI applications tend to produce interesting results, they could be potentially result in adverse outcomes. In fact, many of these advanced generative AI applications tend to what's defined as hallucinate. They generate really convincing but potentially entirely inaccurate results. And their filters in recognizing potentially adverse outcomes are not necessarily fully developed. And there are also specific legal issues arising from generative AI applications. For example, copyright issues, fair use perspectives, data privacy issues. In fact, just recently, there have been class action suits initiated against both OpenAI and Google precisely for these issues that potentially these technologies might infringe upon copyright as well as fair use implications and data privacy implications as well. So having sort of defined the fundamental categories of AI systems, this is in this context, then AI regulation is evolving. And at the vanguard of AI regulation is the EU, and they have developed a proposed artificial intelligence regulation, which is called the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. In fact, it's expected that by the end of this summer, perhaps early fall, the European Parliament and the European Commission will in fact ratify the current version of the Artificial Intelligence Act. And they have taken into consideration this classification of AI systems, and they developed a spectrum of AI classifications. At the top of it is what's defined as unacceptable risk. And these are prohibited AI applications. So things such as social scoring applications, applications that perhaps create subliminal and manipulative techniques, maybe exploit people's vulnerabilities, or may impact their socioeconomic status, as well as real-time biometric identification systems, particularly in publicly available spaces. So these within the EU regulation are deemed to be prohibited AI systems. They should not be introduced at all, not should be commercialized at all. The next level down, what you can see here is what's defined as high-risk AI systems. And these are AI systems that could have the propensity to create adverse outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain categories of high-risk AI systems that are specifically included within the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. And these include, for example, systems that impact education, employment, law enforcement, creditworthiness, border control management, criminal justice system, social media recommender systems, where there needs to be significant control and guardrails implemented around the implementation of these high-risk AI systems. And the EU Artificial Intelligence Act imposes rigorous obligations on the providers of AI systems to ensure that the technology actually meets the expected outputs and objectives for these systems, including, for example, before they place such AI systems on the market, there needs to be what's called ex-ante conformance testing. So before they place these products on the market, there needs to be rigorous testing, quality assurance, data governance to make sure that these systems mitigate potential compliance risks. And then the next level down, really the two categories are minimal and no risk AI applications. And while there are no specific obligations imposed within the regulation for these, there is certainly a recommendation for organizations to institute voluntary codes of conduct to ensure that the AI systems produce desirable outcomes and that the consumers who are using them are aware. For example, when you're interfacing with a chatbot, that you are aware of the fact that you're interfacing with a chatbot. Overall, I think what we're seeing right now is evolution of rigorous legislation. The Artificial Intelligence Act by the European Union could become a template for other jurisdictions to follow. There are other jurisdictions that are currently looking at implementation of our regulations, and I think the next big challenge is going to be harmonizing these regulations across different jurisdictions. So I think it's important to appreciate where we are right now with these more advanced large language models and what's defined as generative AI applications. And certainly, there seems to be a lot of utility associated with, a lot of hype, a lot of momentum in commercializing applications of generative AI. I mean, Microsoft is certainly has embedded an instance of OpenAI into their platform. But still, I think there are significant concerns about potential adverse impacts, potential nefarious uses of generative AI applications. For example, with respect to disinformation campaigns, it might fall into the hands of nefarious actors. It might be misappropriated. Generative AI applications could be concentrated in the hands of a few organizations. So there needs to be, significant guardrails put around generative AI, and we have to make sure that there's a balance between its utility and potential harmful impacts. Recently, Stanford University, the Stanford Research on Foundation Models has produced, I think, a very interesting analysis of various generative AI applications. And they used various attributes to really measure the efficacy of these AI systems as well as conformance with the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act. And by and large, they found that there are significant deficiencies in terms of data governance, in terms of quality assurance, in terms of compliance with legal issues such as copyright implications, also in terms of potential risk mitigation measures in place. Clearly, even OpenAI has acknowledged that the outcomes of their algorithms are not necessarily accurate, and that has a propensity to produce inaccurate results. So I think we're at this early stage of commercialization, and it's extremely important to ensure that regulations, in fact, impose obligations, perhaps a heightened sense of obligations, to undertake specific conformance testing and analysis and testing of these systems before they place them on the market. And then finally, I just want to mention a couple of things about where the current state of regulation is. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the early stage. The EU is certainly at the forefront of delivering the first meaningful, comprehensive AI regulation. But it's going to take some time, even when it's ratified and implemented, for it to have full impact. A good comparison is when the General Data Protection Regulation was ratified. It took a couple of years for organizations to really fully comply with these regulations, and the same is expected from AI regulation. And this is the reason why just recently the European Union and the US have agreed on a collaborative effort to make sure that they work very closely with the technology community, with the providers of AI systems, to implement more rigorous voluntary codes of conduct to fill this legislative void before the legislation becomes fully functional and operative. And that sort of brings me to the next topic, which is, while we don't have these regulations, the opportunity and the obligation to really comply with more rigorous risk management standards will fall to standards organizations. Both within the EU as well as within the US and other jurisdictions, regulators are working very closely with standards organizations. The National Institute of Science and Technology just released earlier the risk management framework, which provides a comprehensive set of guidelines and best practices to ensure that AI systems are introduced to the marketplace with sufficient level of risk management frameworks in place from across the entire life cycle of these systems, from design to implementation to operationalizing and post-implementation support. And similarly, NONEC, which is a similar organization in the EU, is working closely with the EU regulators to deliver similar types of risk management frameworks. And these organizations then will be responsible for auditing the performance and the operational characteristics of these AI systems. And the certification process will be, in fact, delegated to these standards organizations. But again, this is going to take some time for being fully implemented and operationalized. So in the meantime, it's going to be really incumbent on developers and providers of AI systems to really comply with voluntary codes of conduct, because ultimately it delivers fundamental benefits. It makes good business sense for them to do so. So at the end of the process, really, when we really look at where we are right now with AI regulations, it is fundamentally something that requires collaboration between different stakeholders, not just regulators, not just standards organizations, but also developers themselves. And it's important to adhere to and implement rigorous, trustworthy AI best practices. In terms of accomplishing that, organizations should take into consideration three main dimensions of what constitutes trustworthy AI. The first is the impact of AI systems. Fundamentally, it should benefit society as a whole. It should lift people up. It should avoid harm. So the impact of AI systems should have a moral or ethical quality. The second real fundamental pillar of trustworthy AI is that it should be fair. And there's two dimensions of that. One is, of course, procedural fairness, that the AI systems produces similar outcomes for similar individuals or groups of individuals, but also it should have a distributive fairness dimension to it. And that is that there should be human oversight as to the outcomes of the AI system. And the AI system may produce statistically accurate results, but it may not be fair. So there needs to be a human oversight to ensure that the system produces fair outcomes and it protects disadvantaged groups that may be adversely impacted by the outcomes of the AI system, notwithstanding that it produces accurate outcomes. And the third is individual autonomy. There should be significant opportunity for individuals to have control over how AI systems impact their lives. And this is certainly one of the fundamental pillars of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, is that it does impose on developers significant obligations for transparency, autonomy, explainability of AI systems to be able to enable consumers to have better visibility of how AI systems impact them and be able to make informed choices around the AI systems. And also for consumers, the ability to override the outcomes of the AI system. And therefore, this whole notion of the uncontestability of the AI systems that I mentioned earlier becomes really important and provide a much more effective way for consumers to protect their rights, their human rights and their economic rights as well. And therefore to have a better legal framework in place for them to recover potential damages in the event of harmful impact that's been proven. So these are, I think, the fundamental, dimensions of where we are with AI regulation, the concept of trustworthy AI. Ultimately, in the end, as I mentioned, it requires collaboration between different stakeholders. Ultimately, it's make good business sense because if you have trustworthy AI, engenders trust, equity, and of course, creates sustainable competitive advantages for organizations.
That's really interesting, Andrew. So I think all of these different facets that we've covered are extremely important for people in the enterprise to really understand what the impact can be of artificial intelligence, how to navigate it. And definitely, I would say when they start on their journey, they should be looking at narrow AI to start with, for sure. And look at those categories that can really help solve certain business problems very quickly, very specifically, before even moving towards the generative conversation or the generative technologies. And definitely keep an eye out for how these systems can actually make their worth known in the production environment, because that's definitely the thing that I'm still seeing, because everybody's still trying to figure out exactly what the different implications are, what the impact, justice, and autonomy is going to be of these systems in a production environment. Because right now, I have not seen a lot of these capabilities in high impact places in the production environments. But I think where we're heading is definitely interesting, but it's good that we're having all of these conversations already up front to ensure that we do it fairly, we do it justly. I think that's my takeaway from today.
Yeah. Fully agreed. And I think, as you pointed out, Maxine, it's important to also contextualize the applications of these AI systems. And the more specific the application is, purpose built for certain things, the higher the likelihood that you're going to have highly accurate training data around which outcomes can be accurate and fair. So I think it's going to take some time for organizations to really fully integrate these sort of more advanced AI systems into their business environment. And it's very important to test, and make sure that the data governance strategy is comprehensive before they really commercialize and introduce these solutions to the marketplace in general.
Awesome. Andrew, taking all of that into account, if we look at the next big topic, really, which comes to, I would say, compliance, costs, and impact of these capabilities, what are your thoughts on that?
Mhm.
Do we have a safe haven that customers can go to?
Yeah. Right. So, yeah, I think you raised a really important point here, Maxime, and that is assuming that you've implemented an AI system and you commercialized it, there's going to be an ongoing obligation on the part of organizations to demonstrate compliance with the regulatory framework in place. And one dimension of this is the ability to provide auditing and traceability of the performance of AI systems. For instance, the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act requires organizations to maintain a log of their activities relating to the AI system, documentation, record keeping, obligations. And they will be required, if in the event that there is demonstrated harmful impact, to be able to show that in fact they have implemented rigorous compliance processes in place, that they're following these processes. And typically auditing requirements tend to be challenging because often it requires a sort of a spot audit, maybe in a subset of the data. Maybe they don't have specific visibility into the granular details of how their internal compliance processes are executing. And so from this perspective, it will be helpful for organizations to really consider how more advanced process intelligence technologies, such as process mining, can be potentially deployed for organizations to really gain a much more detailed data-driven visibility of their compliance processes. And for organizations that may not be familiar with process intelligence, or what is commonly referred to as process mining, it is an emerging application that enables organizations to collect event log data from various systems of record and be able to then normalize that event log data. For example, what happened to a particular object or event, when it happened, and be able to visualize this information in a very detailed manner to be able to identify potential compliance inefficiencies, bottlenecks, be able to surface the root cause of process inefficiencies and bottlenecks, and be able to remediate and, in fact, undertake conformance testing against the desired process flow versus what actually is happening. And this is where I think it would be helpful for organizations to really consider implementing and considering the value of process intelligence, complementing existing risk management frameworks to ensure that they can mitigate their potential compliance risks, as well as to be able to demonstrate in a very proactive way that they've taken specific proactive steps to comply with the regulatory requirements provided within AI regulations. And in fact, for this conversation, we have developed a proof of concept demonstration of how process intelligence could be effectively deployed for a commonly occurring use case within financial services, especially within banking. And as you can appreciate, banking is one of the most heavily regulated industries. Banks already have rigorous requirement obligations with respect to risk management frameworks in place. And banks will have to consider augmenting those tools with more granular tools, such as process intelligence, to help them ensure that they can mitigate the compliance risks. And in this demonstration that we'll share with you, we're using a lending use case or a credit decision use case, which has a number of steps associated with it, as well as potential different ways of process execution for each loan application. And we're going to demonstrate in this use case how process intelligence can be used to identify potential compliance gaps and also surface the root causes and model out what the impact might be of potentially remediate those changes, and be able to also determine whether or not the organization is in fact complying with prescribed protocols, and be able to identify potential missteps or lack of following the specific prescribed compliance steps.
That's really interesting, Andrew. Thanks for sharing that. I think
Yeah.
it's going to be great to be sharing this particular POC that we did around this particular topic. You know, throughout this episode of our podcast, we've talked through different regulations and what's really driving that today. I think we've all seen that it's really important to understand the different kinds of impact that artificial intelligence can have. And now also, as we now know in which categories some of these AI systems will fall, including high risk systems as well, and which performance or actually risk management standards we have to be able to then leverage process intelligence to combine all of these things, could look at both the capabilities of your process and ensuring that's running smoothly, but at the same time, be able to be compliant when it comes to AI. I think that's really a great message for us to be sharing with our audience today. So like you said, I'll be attaching the demo that you created to showcase that specifically at the end of this episode for whoever wants to come over and see it. But I think overall, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. and having us walk through the landscape of artificial intelligence, not so much from a technical side this time, but much more from the legislation, compliance, ethical side of it. I think it was a very interesting journey to embark on. And I hope you had fun as well, same as I did.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, Maxime, and I hope that the audience can benefit from this and certainly be looking forward to additional insights that we can share with you. But this is an interesting, evolving, rapidly evolving market. And I think it's important at the end of the day to ensure that there is a proper balance between promoting innovation and regulation. The two really go hand in hand. And I think it's important to promote that sort of balance so that we can preserve and protect consumer rights at the same time, advance the state of the art of the technology.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more. Thanks again. And I hope to have you on for another session pretty soon.
Thank you.
See you later.
You too. Take care.
And that's a wrap on another insightful episode of our podcast. A huge thank you to Andrew Pery for joining us today and sharing his invaluable insights on AI ethics and legislation. It's really conversations like these that not only enlighten us, but also challenge us to think critically about the future of technology and its role in our lives. Now, before we sign off, remember to check out the special demonstration attached to this episode. You'll find it in the comments section or the description. It's a practical showcase of how process intelligence can play a pivotal role in the banking sector, particularly in credit decisioning. A perfect complement to today's discussion. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, don't forget to share it with your friends and colleagues. And if you missed part 1, be sure to catch up for the full picture of our deep dive into AI legislation and ethics on the AI-Driven Enterprise podcast. I'm Max, and it's been a pleasure guiding you through these complex and fascinating topics. Stay tuned for more insightful episodes of the AI-Driven Enterprise podcast as we continue to explore the dynamic world of AI. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious about the wonders of artificial intelligence. Thank you for listening, and take care.